Welcome to the School of Occupational Therapy. My name is Lynn Chaw, and I'm the Director of the School of Occupational Therapy. And I would like to open with acknowledging that we at Dalhousie are located on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. They have taught us to know that we were all treaty people. The TRC calls us to action in education and in the communities in which we work and the people that we serve in occupational therapy. Today, we are honored with the endowment from Kelly Bang's family that in her memory, we can take action, follow examples of strengthening our engagement to make community occupations better for all people. Those joining us are invited to stay after the lecture for a bit of a celebration here in the Tupper Theatre B to enjoy some light refreshments. For those in the room, just in a housekeeping issue, in case of an emergency, we ask that you exit the building through the Tupper link through those doors. We are pleased to be able to offer this session in live stream and face-to-face, so we are recording this. This lecture will be followed with a quick question and answer session. We will take questions from the floor and questions from the live stream as well. The Kelly Bang Lectureship celebrates the memory of Kelly Bang, a nationally known occupational therapist, lecturer, writer, artist, and counselor for survivors of children and sexual abuse. The memorial lecture was established by her family to honor those whose research, practice, teaching, and advocacy have advanced opportunities for women and other marginalized adults who are learning to live in their communities. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce our 18th Kelly Bang lecturer, Kaarina Valavaara. In 2011, Kaarina graduated with an MSc in Occupational Therapy. As a new graduate, she stepped up to volunteer to chair the Occupational Therapy and Indigenous Health Network. Kaarina has been advocating with the Occupational Therapy and Indigenous Health Network for 10 years in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action. Before entering occupational therapy, Kaarina spent a year in the Indigenous Youth Internship Program in the British Columbia Public Service, where she was surrounded by amazing Indigenous leaders and mentors who instilled in her the importance of using her privilege in education to serve communities. Kaarina's work is dedicated towards decolonizing approaches, including the roles on the Occupational Therapy, CAOT, Indigenous Health Network. The nomination tonight speaks to her advocacy for social visions of occupational therapy, decolonization, working towards culturally safe approaches. It is my honor to invite Kaarina Valavaara to come and give us a lecture on advocacy as community, reflections and lessons learned as an Indigenous occupational therapist. Let's welcome her.
Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, virtually or in person, to attend this evening. I am incredibly grateful and humbled to be here to share part of my story. Sincere thank you to those who nominated and selected me for this opportunity, and thank you for that warm introduction. So I just want to echo the previous land acknowledgement. I also recognize that I'm on the ancestral and unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. I am new, just having moved here in September from Treaty 7 territory in Alberta. I am grateful for the opportunities to live, work, and play here. This is my new favorite dog park, as a result of the peace and friendship treaties. And I am striving to learn how to live out my part of this relationship in a good way as a guest here. So in the spirit of what I have learned about Kelly Bang and her legacy in this lectureship, in my time here today, through sharing my experiences and lessons learned about advocacy, I hope to inspire occupational therapists, and in that I include any students listening here today, to pursue advocacy as part of our individual and collective professional responsibility to uphold Indigenous rights, advance reconciliation, and promote occupational justice. I recognize that many occupational therapists are feeling increased or new responsibilities this year with the atrocities of the residential schools laid bare for all Canadians and the whole world to see, and with the first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation prompting us all to learn more about the impacts of colonization in our country. So I'll be talking today from my position as an Indigenous Occupational Therapist, and I'm speaking primarily to those folks who feel more responsibility to participate actively in acts of reconciliation, to those in the audience who have time and ability to participate in advocacy efforts, but perhaps feel intimidated, unsure, or overwhelmed on where to start, to those who are frustrated with the ongoing disparities between Indigenous and settler Canadians we see in practice and want to do something about it. I also hope through sharing part of my story that I can have us all think critically about how we can better support clinicians and frontline occupational therapists to participate in advocacy to advance our professional response to truth and reconciliation. I'm only speaking for myself and not other Indigenous occupational therapists or people, and I can only claim expertise to my story. I don't claim to be an expert in advocacy. I am still learning and making lots of mistakes as I go, and we'll share a few of those today. I also want to share off the top a few choices I've made in this lecture. First, I'm trying to highlight additional Indigenous voices whenever I can. So those that are better at knowing the literature than me will notice a preference to cite the small amount of Indigenous scholars we have in occupational therapy. And while I'll make some selected references to occupational therapy scholarship, I have not tried to validate my experience with empirical science or literature more broadly. It was tempting as I was working on this, especially when I get to talking about what building a community has meant, to want to back it up with some research to show that, yes, community has X, Y, and Z benefits on mental health or whatever it is. But this tendency can unintentionally invalidate Indigenous knowledge unless it is backed up by science or published works. With all that said, I would like to start with introducing myself and some of the principles and values that ground me to this work. I need you to know where I come from and my connections before I share my story or be so bold as to offer any advice. I am Métis on my mother's side and Finnish on my father's side, hence all the A's in my very Scandinavian name. I recognize this lineage also gives me an immense amount of privilege and access as a light-skinned person who does not experience the negative impacts of racism other Indigenous people and people of color face when accessing the spaces that occupational therapists work, like healthcare, justice, or education. So for those who aren't familiar, members of the Métis Nation, such as myself and my family, are a unique Indigenous people of First Nations and French/Scottish descent that emerged in the 1800s in the Red River area of Manitoba, across the prairies, and up into northwestern Ontario, where my family is originally from. The goal of colonization in Canada has been for Indigenous people to no longer exist as unique nations and to assimilate into white Canadian society. For the Métis, this meant government-run shams like the script system meant to deprive Métis people of a homeland and community connections. The federal government also did not formally recognize Métis existence until advocates forced it when the Constitution was ratified in 1982, which means that the federal government has and continues not to live up to its responsibilities to Métis people. So, and many families like mine were scattered throughout the country to make a living and survive in times of hardship. I was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, but raised in Tunaha Territory in southeastern BC, where we followed my grandparents out there for work. So my family, like many Métis families, were taught to hide and not be proud of our Indigenous heritage, likely as a matter of survival. Even though my family held many traditional Métis practices and cultural values, from my great aunt jigging at weddings to hours with my grandfather teaching me how to live on and respect the land. It wasn't until I specifically sought out education in my undergraduate in Native Studies, and many Métis people have this in common, that I saw my Métis identity with any sense of pride. Through education, I was able to learn more about the true history of Indigenous people in Canada, including the incredible resistance and resiliency of the Métis people to ongoing impacts of colonization. I recognize that I'm incredibly fortunate to have the education and opportunities that I have. I completed my education with support from my family, from the Métis Nation of BC, and from amazing Indigenous mentors I've had. I recognize, as Lynn shared, that I have responsibilities to my community and other Indigenous people that have not had the same privilege and access as me. And I'm very inspired by this quote, even though I'm not a researcher. Research is about collective responsibility. We can only go so far before we see a face, our elder cleaning fish, our sister living on the edge in East Vancouver, and hear a voice whispering, "Are you helping us?" And this is from Indigenous scholar Margaret Kovac. And I think it resonates with those of us in occupational therapy or in helping professions, or whatever the role may be. It reminds us that we are not othered from the clients and patients that we claim to serve. Métis people have been leaders in fighting for recognition of Indigenous land rights, rights to consultation, and rights to self-determination and self-governance. I try to locate myself in that ongoing fight by continually grounding the work that I do as an occupational therapist in recognition of Indigenous rights. Rights that include, but are certainly not limited, to self-determination in healthcare, and rights to access healthcare services without discrimination, and where Indigenous cultures and wisdom are central to care. Increasing scholarship in occupational therapy has reinforced this need for us to hold a commitment to Indigenous and human rights in our practice. As regulated health professionals, we are required to be aware of legislation that impacts our practice, and we should be fiercely advocating for their respect within our professional standards, ethics, and interactions. We should think deeply about what occupational therapy would look like if understanding treaties and Indigenous rights were held in the same regard as complying with legislation around privacy and scope of practice. Respecting Indigenous rights is not an add-on or a trend, and it should ground us when the work of advocacy gets hard and requires sacrifice, which it most certainly will. So during the lecture today, I'm going to have some moments for you to pause and think about your own roles and opportunities for advocacy as occupational therapists. Again, students are in this. These reflective sunglasses pictured here will be your prompt to turn some questions and thoughts around on yourself. So before jumping in more to share more about my advocacy story, I would like us to collectively reflect on the power and influence we have as a profession that claims advocacy as a core skill and really claims it as part of our professional identity. So as occupational therapists, especially those of us like me who are primarily clinicians, we are used to being a profession that does not have the most power. We are used to our recommendations being ignored at the rounds table and our equipment requests being denied by benefit programs. However, I want us to be so careful not to use this as an excuse to minimize our ability to influence the health and well-being of our clients through advocacy. We may not have the most, quote, power or authority in the hierarchical and exceedingly complex and layered systems we work in, but we have such great influence as part of providing care to clients, educating students, managing staff, doing research, whatever role you're in. I think about my own practice, which has been primarily in acute care and inpatient rehab settings. Even if I don't have as much power as other professions, I, as the occupational therapist, have massive influence over whether a client is deemed safe to be discharged home. Our assessments are given great weight when deciding whether someone is capable and has the rights to make decisions over their own life. Insurance companies and government agencies rely on our assessments to determine whether or not a client will have access to funding for a wheelchair or for home modifications. I see this notably as we reflect on providing culturally safe care with and for Indigenous people. We have to recognize that despite our good intentions, we are situated in institutions like healthcare or education, which have been vessels of deeply violent colonial harm. Anyone paying attention to the news knows that racism continues to harm and kill Indigenous peoples in healthcare settings. Cultural safety at its core is a shift of power. Power back to the Indigenous person receiving care to decide whether an interaction is safe. Power from the healthcare provider as one of expert to one of collaborator who engages in reciprocal learning. Part of cultural safety is also in challenging oppressive systems, and that is where advocacy really comes in. but we cannot effectively transfer power if we don't first acknowledge the power that we have. I had thought initially I would break up these reflective questions and recommendations to those with power and influence and clinicians/students, but that's a false dichotomy, and that can just be used to let ourselves off the hook. There will always be somebody in the systems we work in with more power, with more decision-making ability than us. But I'm struck by the wording that comes here in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action number 22, when referring to acknowledging the rightful place of Indigenous elders in healing practices and care. The wording is, those who can affect change. This doesn't require a title or specific education to be compelled into action. Our current profile of occupational therapy practice in Canada, which I know is in the process of being revamped, but it's still relevant today, it references the skill of advocacy 9 times. 7 for competent practice and 2 for proficient practice. This is something, I bring this up because this is something that has been drilled into us, and I'm sure the students here know that better than anyone, as part of our core competencies. And every clinician worth their salt that I've ever worked with is an excellent advocate for their patients and clients. We are good at speaking up in rounds, advocating for admission to rehab or community programs, appealing insurance claims, you name it. But how do we move beyond just being good at advocating for our individual clients and move to make changes where power is shared, where we lobby key decision makers, and start to make those systems level changes that we all know will benefit our clients? There are many occupational therapy scholars and activists who have written and presented much more eloquently and thoroughly than I can ever do regarding our professional imperative to address the social determinants of health and start thinking at that more systems level. I'm not going to repeat that today. It's out there. You're all clever people. You can find it. Rather, I hope to challenge you to think about how to just get started and take those first steps in your own advocacy journey, whatever it looks like, to start affecting change wherever you can. Okay, so now that I've located myself, I can share some of my story in starting in advocacy. It started in a lecture theater, not unlike this one, in 2009, when I started my entry-level OT program in Alberta. I had just completed this amazing 1-year internship and felt like I was being sent into my future career full of hope and responsibility, having been lifted up and given such amazing teachings by the strong Indigenous women who ran that program at the time. But a few weeks in, that hope shattered. And I remember where I was sitting, but not the context of the lesson. But I remember somehow a debate was posed about the state of First Nations housing in Canada. And the fact that some of my non-Indigenous classmates felt entitled to spout the most horrible stereotypes with such certainty and confidence just stunned me. Of course, many others spoke up to refute those stereotypes, which should not be minimized, the importance of that. But this moment was the first time in the world of occupational therapy that I clearly thought, I'm alone and I don't belong here. And I've reflected on that moment over and over and over again about why it was so galvanizing and why I was even shocked by the racism. I was in my 20s and naive in many ways, but I was certainly not naive to racism against Indigenous people. And what I've landed on is how this, even being posed as a debate, assumed that occupational therapists are the us and Indigenous people are the them. And it assumed that there were no Indigenous people in the room. It was also the first time that I saw how our professional claims that I was being taught about how we're holistic and client-centered were just so easily undone by racism. I also recognize that what was a galvanizing moment for me could have just as easily been a moment where I shrunk back into my seat, feeling like it was unsafe to be both an occupational therapist and an Indigenous person. I credit the fact that I had just finished this amazing internship, being surrounded by the support of other strong Indigenous youth and mentors, and I still had their voices fresh in my mind as the reason I pushed ahead. And I want to acknowledge that the program I went to and many across the country have made immense changes in response to the TRC. And since graduating, I was able to join in various roles with the University of Alberta as part of their reconciliation journey. And goodness knows I don't want to be reminded of mistakes I made 12 years ago. But I bring this up because it was a defining moment for me. and because I want educators listening here tonight to know that myself and other Indigenous colleagues hear nearly every year from an occupational therapy student somewhere across the country who tells us how alone they feel and that they don't see themselves or their family represented in the classroom. So I bring this up to say that any of us that are involved with students in any way have such responsibility in cultivating future advocates. For me, I spent the next 2 years in my program in just a spiral, trying to find any way to reconcile Indigenous ways of knowing, lived experiences in occupational therapy. I tried to reach out to other student healthcare groups, but schedules never really lined up, and I wasn't in nursing or medicine, so it just never really fit. It wasn't until one night in my second year where I was once again desperately searching for anything related to occupational therapy and Indigenous people that I stumbled across this newly formed Occupational Therapy and Indigenous Health Practice Network hosted by the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapists, and I wrote an email begging to be involved. So this network was and is a group of settler ally and Indigenous occupational therapy clinicians, students, educators, and researchers who are dedicated to improving occupational therapy with Indigenous people. This was the first time I really felt I could see a future for myself in the profession and felt any small sense of belonging. As I started working full-time as a new grad in acute care in Edmonton and then later in Calgary, I stayed on as best as I could with the network. Shortly after, I was asked to chair it when the position became vacant and they were seeking an Indigenous leader. This was completely overwhelming. I didn't have nearly enough experience compared to the other clinicians and researchers on the network, but this community was so important to me and was still how I tried to make sense of my practice with Indigenous people that I agreed to do it. Ultimately, I was in my 20s, I knew how to send an email and book a teleconference, and I just hoped that those with more experience would fill in the content. I made lots of mistakes, and I remember having to Google how to take minutes and write an agenda. I'm ever thankful to those members who continually stepped in when I was in over my head in terms of managing conflicting ideas, navigating priorities, and finding next steps. I was also pushed through the network in those early years and given opportunities through the network to consider publishing my experiences and join on various conference presentations. And while I didn't have research credentials or years of clinical experience to share, I quickly learned what skills I could bring in addition to my lived experiences. I'm relatively organized and I know my way around PowerPoint, so in the early years, I would volunteer to be the one to finalize the presentation and make it pretty, to book the meetings, to double check the references. I also came to learn how to utilize my Native Studies degree when the time came to provide education on the context of colonization and occupational therapy in Canada. In the next few years, I met who is now my closest colleague and dear friend pictured with me above, Angie Phoenix. She is also a Métis occupational therapist, working primarily in pediatrics in rural and remote Indigenous communities. We met when we were asked to share our experiences for a student project at the University of Manitoba, and we've talked about this being the first time that we really thought our voices were worth sharing and that anyone would want to listen. And we really started to feel like we had a role to try to shape occupational therapy practice. Angie soon after joined me as co-chair of the network, which was just in the nick of time, as I'd been running it for a few years and had been feeling really directionless about where to take it. And I was trying to step down, feeling like I didn't have anything else to share. We started realizing that we were better and more impactful together, and really started combining our efforts, both driven by the fact that the models, theories, and standards of practice just didn't fit with what we knew as Indigenous people and the needs we saw in our respective areas of practice. We've never claimed to have the fix or the answer, but didn't know how else to reconcile what we were seeing on the ground, and started with just trying to raise awareness that something needed to change to become better occupational therapists with and for Indigenous people. We started trying to be proactive, to write short articles and tag onto projects or publications that might raise awareness that just being client-centered or holistic wasn't good enough and wasn't serving Indigenous people or communities. We knew that we needed to get the attention of people in power, so we always scrambled to get an abstract submitted to the annual CAOT conference because we knew educators, researchers, and leaders attended them, and we could try to reach this important audience and make connections. things really changed for us in 2017 when momentum for responses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action started building, and we were able to align our efforts to this much larger movement. Angie and I were approached by some members of a planning committee for an annual meeting of occupational therapy leaders at the 2017 conference in Charlottetown to provide some advice on how they could address truth and reconciliation during this day. And during the meeting, it was becoming kind of increasingly clear to Angie and I that any day about reconciliation with Indigenous people really needed to involve Indigenous people in the room in some way. I tried to bring this up, and those who have ever had to have a conversation with me know how quiet and quickly I tend to speak, which is only a million times worse when I'm nervous, as I was that day. So I mumbled something about how maybe it might be good for an Indigenous person to be there, and of course no one listened to that. But thankfully, those on the call spoke with much more authority and certainty and confidence, and said it was absolutely necessary that we be involved if the profession was serious about reconciliation. And this was a shift. We were invited to help lead this day of reflection on truth and reconciliation. I wasn't privy to all the details of who would pay for what, but Angie and I were provided with some funding to attend, which was huge. It made us feel like we were valued and decreased the financial burden we usually faced when attending these conferences. This was an opportunity for us to address occupational therapy leaders and compel actions towards reconciliation. I had full-on imposter syndrome in the room, being struck by recognizing the names of people on my textbooks in the room that day. But on that day and today, we are fortunate to be surrounded by amazing allies who continue to step up and show up when we ask for help. They teach us how to distill our messages, make persuasive arguments, and calm us down and point us in better directions when we are frustrated or overwhelmed. And from that time, Angie and I, we really found that opportunities snowballed. Now that we had faces to put to names and proved that we had important contributions to share, we could continue to build a strong network and really be deliberate. We were able, through relationships and through the communities we were building, to build a unique vantage point. We have kind of bits and pieces of knowledge of various challenges and projects and opportunities across the country to really help us build our understanding of where we should focus our efforts. I want to highlight a little bit of the work that I'm particularly proud of, not to brag about how much we've accomplished, but to show how important keeping relationships and community is at the center of everything we do, and to emphasize that it's only through building these relationships that we, as clinicians, have been able to bring some Indigenous perspectives to projects that set some of the standards for occupational therapy practice in Canada. So in 2018, we were invited to participate on the working group on the updated CAOT position statement on occupational therapy and Indigenous health. And the collective group working on this was really able to push the boundaries at the time of what a position statement is and provide recommendations for OTs both individually and at that more systems level. We're also really able to use this as an opportunity to provide more education to those who are interested in understanding more about their roles and responsibilities. In 2019, we were invited to guest edit a special edition of OT Now, which we really thought was a great opportunity to shape some of the conversations around reconciliation and highlight voices of Indigenous occupational therapists and allies. You know, and it's not up there, but we've been able to provide some input on some upcoming textbooks and competency documents, again, just to try to ensure that some of the needs of Indigenous peoples and communities are considered in some of the foundations of our practice in Canada. In 2019, Angie and I were asked to lead the Truth and Reconciliation Task Force, originally started by CAOT to align responses to the TRC to their strategic plan. And the second we were given this opportunity, we made sure we could include some of our allies to have people that we knew could complement our skills and help us on this important path. We have spent much of our time on this task force building relationships with occupational therapy leaders and organizations, figuring out how we all fit and work together to advance the calls to action. It's been hard not to just want to jump in and fix things, but it has become increasingly obvious that without strong relationships, we cannot make the sustainable, long-term changes needed in the profession. As I look ahead, our advocacy still continues to be primarily focused on making space within OT to be open and responsive to Indigenous rights, perspectives, and experiences. And certainly part of that has to be in lifting up more Indigenous voices and Indigenous leaders to shape our profession. So looking back on the last 10 years, I am so lucky and thankful that now when things get challenging, I'm no longer alone in a lecture theater. I have amazing mentors and allies who I can text or call to vent or to strategize about how to respond and how to share the work. Working in acute care and inpatient settings, change can seem impossible, and advocacy has provided me with a sense of feeling like I'm contributing to something bigger and doing something to address the ongoing disparities I see. And I want to talk about the last 2 lessons I have here on how building community has improved advocacy and that relationships are required for the long haul, with sharing what has been one of the longer advocacy efforts on behalf of the Occupational Therapy and Indigenous Health Practice Network. This is a case where I was thinking too short-sighted, and too small, and thankfully was surrounded by others who pushed me to lead better. So since I joined the network in 2011, there had been concerns about non-insured health benefits, or NIHB, the health benefits program administered by the federal government to First Nations people. Clinicians on the network working directly with NIHB had raised issues for years about inequitable coverage and processes compared to other benefit programs in Canada, and they emphasized just how these issues exacerbated health inequities of Indigenous people, especially those in rural and remote areas waiting on necessary supplies and equipment. We had tried to reach out various times and volunteers on the network to NIHB, but it never really went anywhere. I was demoralized and didn't feel like we had any influence as volunteers to impact NIHB. And what I think was erroneously steered us away from this as a network to thinking, and I thought that someone with more influence and power would and should take up the cause. But concerns kept rightly coming up from clinicians, and thankfully a few years later, the network had grown in size and momentum, and there was a new collective energy to try again. By this time, Angie and I and others on the network had developed good working relationships with CAOT staff and leaders from our meetings at conferences and other projects. And this good relationship meant we could more easily provide feedback from our amazingly knowledgeable group of volunteers to CAOT's more formal advocacy structure. And this timed well with a national review of the program in 2017 being conducted by the Assembly of First Nations. Some of our suggestions to improve prescription for various medical supplies and equipment were ultimately adopted into the program at the time. Are these changes perfect or enough? Of course not. And we must all push each other to not think that incremental changes to a government program somehow equals equity. But it felt like a win at the time. And it showed me that we could have a role in advocacy as volunteers, even to something as daunting as the federal government, so long as we had the right partners. And today, the network is more proactive in advocacy and is looking to partner with researchers to make recommendations for changes to programs and policies which impact Indigenous people. And now I recognize that small changes can open the doors to larger ones, and community can make what might be a long journey possible. Okay, sunglasses are up. It's reflection time, so I'm going to turn it back on you all again. So, if I can be so bold as to give some recommendations. So my first one is really, if you are looking to step into advocacy, if you're that person, you're in that place in your life, please do your homework. And this is particularly important for non-Indigenous or settler OTs, who at this time are the overwhelming majority of our profession. So I'm talking to this audience in particular right now. It is non-negotiable that we need to be open to the idea of reciprocal learning and taking the lead from Indigenous peoples, leaders, and communities. You must respect that Indigenous people and communities have the innate abilities to solve their own problems. You may have specific skills and roles to help in this journey, but if you don't believe Indigenous people can solve their own problems with the traditions, wisdom, and teachings that have sustained Indigenous nations since time immemorial, then you are just perpetuating colonial ideologies. So with that, if you are invited to join advocacy work alongside Indigenous people, please honor work that may be ongoing. Perhaps you are coming in with different ideas or perspectives, which can be important, but respect that Indigenous people have, in varying capacities, been trying to solve their own problems, but perhaps have just been missing resources or access. It can be incredibly frustrating and demoralizing when outsiders come in and questions your strategies, outcomes and intentions, or wield expertise and credentials like a sword, without recognizing the historical reasons why Indigenous people in our profession are not yet widely represented in leadership positions or academic spaces. It can be challenging when they don't recognize the competing demands that Indigenous occupational therapists manage. This is very different than coming in as an ally and asking genuine questions in an attempt to build understanding and provide new perspectives and strategies while still respecting Indigenous self-determination. And similarly, I recommend taking the time to do the work of self-reflecting on your own worldviews and positions to make sure you are coming at any work with an open heart and mind to listen and learn from Indigenous people. As occupational therapists, we are conditioned to be fixers and doers. We assess, we break down the task into component parts, we make a SMART goal, and we get to work. So stepping back and learning first can be challenging, but it's necessary. It's the truth in Truth and Reconciliation. Colonialism can only be successful when it hides the truth about violence and oppression done to Indigenous people. It takes time to learn and unlearn, and this will be part of the journey. But we can't get stuck in there, and this will be ongoing. Please assess your commitment. Everyone is busy, but Indigenous people, for the most part, don't get to dip in and out of the work when it's convenient. Obviously, life is unpredictable, and this will be different for everyone, but be sure you are stepping forward in a way that you're not causing extra work for Indigenous people who may need to re-educate and reorient if there's a lot of turnover. Reflect on what you're good at. For me, I've learned that my strengths are often being the worker bee behind the scenes. I'm not going to be the one who comes up with the most bold or creative idea. I'm just not. But I can make sure that those bold ideas translate to an abstract on time. I'll run the meeting. And it took me a long time to be okay with this part of myself and to see value in it. Particularly for those of us who are not outgoing by nature, advocacy can seem like it's for other people. But please know that's not true. And frankly, many times it's important for settlers to cede the stage and take more of those supportive roles so Indigenous voices can break through and be recognized. And as you look to partner with people whose skills complement yours, I reflect, and Angie and I both reflect all the time on how lucky we are that our personalities and skills are so different. Even our practice areas are different. I work urban adults and seniors, she works rural remote pediatrics, so we can really represent concerns from across the spectrum. And so as I encourage you to seek this out intentionally in your work, you first have to do that own work of yourself to figure out where your skills and gifts lie so you can figure out how people can complement you. So I want to talk for a minute about the importance of being intentional about where you align your advocacy efforts as part of this preparation process. As I mentioned, our advocacy work became more effective when we aligned them to the broader awareness of the TRC. And being intentional in this has been integral in sustaining momentum. But the TRC is not the only Indigenous commission or broader movement that OT advocacy work can and should align with. Think about how you can align your work with redressing the disproportionate violence toward Indigenous women and girls as laid out in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Final Report and Calls to Justice. How can your advocacy align with the ongoing protests of Indigenous people to protect land and water? Part of doing your homework and respecting Indigenous self-determination is to learn where you can be an ally and support the priorities that Indigenous people have laid out. Similarly, depending on where your call to advocacy lies, think about being intentional about where you fit within occupational therapy or other systems. I found some level of effectiveness and fairly good response working within and alongside established organizations within OT in Canada. And if that's for you, there are no shortage of volunteer opportunities for communities of practice and networks to be on boards or participate in various projects that come up. And this avenue in particular can be important for non-Indigenous OTs to hold each other accountable and to do any learning or unlearning and preparation that's needed so that when the time is right to bring an Indigenous person on board, they can come into an organization or project with people that are ready and receptive. But working within current systems might not be for you, it might not be available to you, or even appropriate for you. There are amazing grassroots collectives all over social media that have different ideas and opportunities than I've shared that you can explore. Maybe your advocacy needs to be completely outside systems through protest in building new communities. I really don't think it's an either or, I think it's a both and. The task of reconciliation is hard and will require advocacy from many avenues and many different perspectives to be successful. So this leads in to the need for us to learn skills in advocacy, whatever that looks like for you. We take courses as clinicians to advance our skill set, so why is advocacy any different? If we are compelled to, as it says above, to influence political and institutional agendas and chip away at the social causes of occupational deprivation, this will likely take learning new skills and building new capacities. For me, as I've mentioned, having amazing mentors and cultivating these relationships over the past 10 years has been key in being able to learn to be more effective in my advocacy. What skills do you need to improve? Letter writing, meeting facilitation, use of social media? We examine our learning needs every year in one way or another as part of staying licensed. Can you build advocacy into this process to hold yourself accountable to improving it? Similarly, if you have skills in advocacy, how can you share it? Can you push yourself to run webinars or professional development opportunities to move deliberately into more mentorship roles? Okay, I want to close out by sharing what is likely a little bit of an elephant in the room right now, which is my little comic, addressing the very real challenges and barriers in getting involved in advocacy as a clinician. In sharing some of my challenges, I'm not looking for sympathy, but if I don't share these, I'm not being honest in my own story. And if I'm not being honest, I can't pretend to be in a place to provide recommendations for others as they start out in advocacy. We have to acknowledge that being an advocate for change may mean marginalization from those in power who are interested in maintaining the status quo. It is well documented that Indigenous healthcare professionals face the possibility of being punished in their careers for trying to address racism. For Indigenous people, much as I've shared, engaging in advocacy is a valued occupation that creates meaning and purpose as resistance to colonialism. But these roles are not often valued or respected. For me, I was told very clearly by managers early on as a new grad that my advocacy work, while commendable, was to be separate from my paid clinical work. I recognize they're also tied to their own institutional limitations, but it was clear that those two parts of my career were to be separate if I were to remain employed. And as someone who wanted to explore leadership roles one day, I wanted to be a good employee, not just someone who clocked in and out and did the bare minimum. Until just a few months ago, I've always worked full-time on top of my advocacy. Over the years, I became incredibly skilled at booking meetings on my lunch hour and knowing every quiet room or equipment nook in the hospital where I could set up a laptop apart from noisy shared offices. And I thought I was being clever by doing this, and I thought I was managing things. But looking back, I had been pursuing a pace that was incredibly unsustainable and stressful. I eventually started taking vacation time to attend longer meetings or to provide education, which only compounded the problem and was definitely a mistake. I want to make it clear, no one ever asked me to do this. This was a choice, and I need to be better about setting boundaries, and come find me after if you can tell me how to do that. And it's tempting to say, just say no. But I also think back to those early days when Angie and I were just in the stage of getting occupational therapy leaders to prioritize concerns about practice with Indigenous people. If we had just said no to projects already well in motion, they would have carried on without us, and decisions would have been made about Indigenous people that would not have had Indigenous people present. I would say it's only probably in the last 2 years or so, as I've gained some of my own influence, that I felt I could say no and ask for a meeting or way to participate in a way that fits my schedule better. I've also come to learn, albeit the hard way, that by continually offering to volunteer my time and bending to everyone else's schedule that this devalues Indigenous knowledge, experience, and labor. It's been hard to navigate as somebody who went into a helping profession and sees my advocacy work as part of a broader community responsibility. I can't say I figured it out or found that balance or fine line, but it's something I'm incredibly conscious of now. Okay, sunglasses are up, last reflection time. So I want to use this last opportunity as a bit to address those who may be in leadership or management positions, or who may be looking to support clinicians who want to engage in advocacy, or to those who are looking to involve Indigenous people in their advocacy projects. I want to pay close attention to how we can support the small but growing number of Indigenous occupational therapists who are also now coming into positions to bring their own skills, research, and experiences to occupational therapy, which is so beautiful and so needed, but there's still not nearly enough of us yet. I want us to think about how we can support their advocacy efforts and growth in a sustainable way. I won't pretend to know the limitations and expectations of your workplaces. And of course, again, there's larger systemic issues at play which make engaging in advocacy difficult, which are beyond what I can get into. But again, I want to provide some small practical suggestions that would have been helpful in my journey to perhaps give you some ideas as a jumping off point to start thinking about how you can support advocacy in your own place of work and in your own sphere of influence. I know these will not be sufficient for everyone, but we have to start somewhere, and we can't let perfect be the enemy of good. So if you're thinking about how you can support folks, particularly Indigenous people interested in advocacy, and I emphasize the word interested, please don't just assume because someone's Indigenous they want or have the capacity to be involved. So in my time, managers who were able to be more flexible with education time and paid education leave and gave me this time to do my presentations or to facilitate meetings, even if it wasn't directly related to my clinical work, meant I had to use less vacation time, which was great. And maybe it's not education time in another setting, but flexible hours. Think about what might be possible. Additionally, if you're asking to involve Indigenous people and you have a budget, consider how you are compensating their experience and knowledge. I've noticed a huge improvement in this in the past few years, and an acknowledgement that we need to appropriately compensate Indigenous peoples, but it bears repeating and emphasizing. I've worked in public healthcare for 10 years, I get it. There's never money, and we have to demonstrate value in every dollar we spend, but at some point, we have to push to prioritize valuing Indigenous people in our budgets if we are serious about building mutually respectful relationships with that value Indigenous knowledge as much as other consultants or educators. If you're a leader and you have an employee engaged in advocacy roles, can you be sure to value this work in tangible ways? I eventually moved into some leadership positions in my work, but I was hesitant at times to do this because even though I was interested, I didn't have time or space for extra committees to show my commitment or extra work to show that I was serious about advancing my career. I know I missed out on networking opportunities because I had a teleconference over lunch or a project in the evening. And again, choices I made in my career is unfolded in this really beautiful and interesting way. But I can't help wondering what it might have been like if my advocacy roles had been acknowledged on my annual performance evaluations or for consideration for promotions, rather than just being this separate thing that I did. And please be aware that even just the short conversations and asks add up, but it can be very hard as an Indigenous person to say no when we see the stakes on the ground. Please consider your own power when asking to. If you were someone's manager or have influence over them, can they actually say no? Have you offered the terms of involvement in a way that is flexible enough to be respectful of competing priorities and schedules? Lastly, please consider safety when asking Indigenous occupational therapists to participate in advocacy projects. There is still substantial racism from colleagues and peers that Indigenous people are constantly navigating. What is your plan to proactively address this? Indigenous people know when we're being invited as a token or to provide perspective versus substantially participating in an organization that is open to change. Have you done the work to prepare to be actually ready for the knowledge, questions, and wisdom that an Indigenous occupational therapist will bring to the collective pursuit to create an occupational therapy profession that can effectively serve Indigenous peoples and communities? So in closing, I want to leave you with some wisdom from Justice Marie Sinclair, who chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as it relates to the hard work of reconciliation, which I think includes advocacy. Achieving reconciliation is like climbing a mountain. We must proceed a step at a time. It will not always be easy. There will be storms, there will be obstacles, but we cannot allow ourselves to be daunted by the task because our goal is just and it is also necessary. The TRC calls to action and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to justice are not recommendations. They are necessary steps that we cannot ignore or water down if we claim to support equity and justice. Indigenous peoples, survivors of generations of colonial violence, have been incredibly generous in telling us the steps to redress the impact of colonization and to set on a more just future. They've told us what needs to be done. It's up to us, collectively to listen and to build a community where we can be in it for the long haul and use our skills in advocacy to affect change wherever we can. Thank you. Sincere thanks to my community and to those who show up to further the cause of reconciliation within occupational therapy in Canada. Actual thank you. Okay.
I'll do that. My name is Amira. I'm one of the instructors here at the School of OT. Nikki and Lynn had asked me to come up here with Kaarina at the end of her talk to say thank you. And I said, well, is there anything that you'd like me to say? And Nikki said, I'm sure you'll come up with something. And so I was thinking, yeah, okay, I'll come up with something. While Kaarina's talking, I'll come up with something. But your voice, although it was quite quiet at the beginning, your words were so powerful and so humbling and so eloquent that I really didn't come up with anything that I could say that would really do anything of what you said justice. So I just want to say thank you so much for giving this talk. And I think I speak for all of us when I say I'm so excited that you decided to call here home for the next little while.
Thank you. Oh, goodness. Thank you.
So the last part of your work, Kaarina,
Oh, goodness.
is still to take some questions from the
Sure, please.
and or some questions from online.
Yep, for CORCOM, there's been involvement of Indigenous people at varying levels with any kind of large project. Of course, there's always challenges, so I think it's a step forward. I think it's not quite enough, but I think it's come a long way from the one from 2012. So I think it'll be really important as it rolls out, as we start to educate and as we really start to get frontline clinicians on board and understanding. I think there'll just be a huge amount of education about why things as is aren't working. There's still that tendency, I hear it all the time, we're holistic, we're client-centered, we consider the environment in our models. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in just understanding that the current state isn't working. So I think education from, people who look and think and act like those OTs are really important, I think, and that's where I really think allies can come in at multiple levels. I don't know if I'm answering this question, but, and I think just getting some feedback and one of the things I don't have an answer for yet is, are we sure that what we're doing is working for Indigenous clients, and do our current feedback and complaint mechanisms actually function in a way to allow that feedback? Because just because no one's complaining doesn't mean there's not issues. So I'm curious to see how that will go, but I think we'll have responsibilities at multiple levels, both at that high level and both as, local or provincial organizations that are helping roll this out to do that education, I think.